You'd think the most dangerous thing in a neighborhood like Maple Creek Estates would be a rogue lacrosse ball, or perhaps a particularly aggressive gluten allergy. Our little slice of suburban paradise was engineered for tranquility, a place where the color beige came to breed and property values were discussed with the hushed reverence normally reserved for holy relics. The greatest threat to our peaceful, taupe-toned existence wasn't a criminal element. It was a woman armed with a clipboard and a 3-ring binder full of bylaws. Her name was Carol Peterson, but in the privacy of my own mind, and in hushed whispers among the downtrodden, she was simply the Karen. And on this sweltering Tuesday afternoon, I was watching the Karen commit an act of what I could only describe as domestic terrorism. I was slouched on my sofa, trying to find a documentary that didn't involve sad animals or celebrity chefs, when I saw her. A flash of khaki capris and a pastel polo shirt, marching with the grim determination of a drill sergeant across the manicured common area. In her hand, she gripped a long, T-shaped metal tool. A water key. My blood ran cold. "No," I whispered to the empty living room. My wife, Sarah, was out at her book club, blissfully unaware of the impending crisis. "She wouldn't. Nobody is that stupid." I was wrong. Stupidity, I was learning in my retirement, was a vast and renewable resource, and Carol Peterson had a controlling interest in the local supply. She stopped at a small, circular metal plate in the grass median separating our subdivision from the fire station. I knew that plate. I'd consulted on the municipal plans for this neighborhood a decade ago. It was the cover for the dedicated shutoff valve for Fire Station #4. It controlled their building supply, their sprinkler system, and most critically, the fast fill hydrant for their water tanker. With a grunt of effort that was frankly impressive for a woman whose primary form of exercise was writing violation notices, she pried the cover off. She jammed the key into the valve stem below and began to turn. My mind, the mind of a civil engineer who spent 35 years designing and maintaining the water systems that kept cities from dying of thirst or burning to the ground, went into overdrive. I could visualize the mechanism below the grass, a 6-inch quarter-turn ball valve on a ductile iron main. As she put her entire spite-fueled body into it, I could almost hear the faint thump squish as the valve seated, cutting off the flow of 60 psi water. She stood up, dusted her hands on her immaculate capris, and gave a smug, triumphant nod. She had done it. She had declared war on the fire department. And all because of a few dead petunias. Life in Maple Creek Estates was a masterclass in forced conformity. Before I retired, I barely noticed. I'd leave before sunrise, get home after dark, and spend my weekends too tired to care that our homeowners association had bylaws governing the acceptable shade of one's garden hose. But now, with a surplus of time and a lifetime of professional problem-solving instincts going unused, the sheer, oppressive banality of it all was grinding me down. I was Leo Maxwell, a man who once managed billion-dollar infrastructure projects, now reduced to measuring the height of my own grass with a digital caliper to ensure it complied with Bylaw 17, Section C, Paragraph 4. Turf grass length shall not exceed 3 inches, nor be less than 2 1/2, 2.5 inches, to maintain neighborhood aesthetic uniformity. Sarah said I needed a hobby. "You could build a ship in a bottle," she'd suggested. "I'd rather build a bottle to put the entire HOA board in," I'd grumbled back. The board was, of course, a meaningless distinction. It was Carol Peterson's fiefdom. She wasn't just the president. She was the judge, jury, and executioner. Her reign was marked by legendary memos. There was the wind chime moratorium, which decried unregulated tonal pollution. There was the welcome mat edict, which specified that mats could only display generic greetings, welcome, hello, and not provocative personal statements like, hope you brought wine. My personal favorite was the memo about holiday decorations, which included a list of approved emotions that could be represented. Joy was acceptable. Mirth was pushing it. Anything approaching religious fervor was right out. Her power was absolute, because no one dared challenge her. The other residents were either her sycophantic lieutenants, a group I privately called the Beige Brigade, or they were like most people, too busy, too tired, or too scared of being fined for having a trash can visible from the street for more than 6 hours on collection day. The spark that lit the fuse of Carol's current crusade had happened a week prior. Fire Station #4, our friendly neighborhood heroes, held a community outreach day. They let kids climb in the engine, handed out plastic fire helmets, and generally acted like the pillars of the community they were. In the process of maneuvering their massive ladder truck back into its bay, the driver had misjudged the turn by a few inches. The rear wheel had gently rolled over a corner of a flower bed on the common area. But it wasn't just any flower bed. It was Carol's petunia patch, a patch she tended with a fanatical devotion. Technically, it was community property, but she had annexed it through sheer force of will. A neighbor later recounted the confrontation to me in a hushed, terrified whisper over the fence. Carol had marched up to a young firefighter who couldn't have been more than 22. "I understand," Carol had said, her voice a terrifying mix of politeness and venom, "the importance of your large, destructive vehicles, but the bylaws, which I'm sure you haven't had the time to read, are quite clear about vehicular encroachment on manicured floral displays. Section 28, subsection B." The poor kid, bless his heart, had apologized profusely. The whole crew had. They offered to resod the grass and buy her a whole nursery's worth of petunias. But it wasn't about the flowers. It was about deference. It was about power. She demanded a formal, written apology from Fire Chief Miller himself and insisted that the entire station attend a mandatory HOA-led seminar on respecting community aesthetics. Chief Miller, a man whose entire being radiated pragmatic competence, had politely told her to pound sand. This, in Carol's world, was an act of open rebellion. I'd seen her later that day, staring at the utility markers on the sidewalk near the station. A cold dread had trickled down my spine then. I knew what she was looking at. "That's the main water shutoff," I had thought to myself. You'd have to be a special kind of stupid to mess with that. I had underestimated her. And now, as I stared out my window at the closed valve and the smug tyrant marching away, I realized my retirement was about to get a whole lot more interesting. For a full minute, I just sat there, processing the audacity of it, the sheer, weaponized pettiness. Then, the universe decided to raise the stakes. A siren wailed to life, not a distant one, but the full-throated roar of the engine right next door. It was quickly joined by another, and then the blare of the ladder truck's air horn. I looked past Carol's house, towards the horizon. A plume of thick, black smoke was rising into the blue sky. A structure fire. A real one. My engineering brain, rusty from disuse, sparked and roared to life. I knew their protocols. Engine 4 would be first on the scene. They carried about 750 gallons of water in their onboard tank. At a standard attack rate, they'd exhaust that in under 5 minutes. They would need to immediately hook up to a municipal hydrant to sustain the flow. Meanwhile, Tanker 4, a huge truck whose sole purpose was to shuttle water, would be racing back and forth, and its fast fill station, the one that could dump thousands of gallons into its tank in minutes, was located right there at the firehouse. A fast fill station that was now, effectively, a very large, very dry metal box. "She hasn't just inconvenienced them," I muttered. "She could get someone killed." Sarah walked into the living room, drawn by the sirens. My God, Leo, what's happening? I was already on my feet, grabbing my keys from the bowl by the door. My old instincts, dormant for months, were firing on all cylinders. This was no longer about HOA nonsense. This was a problem. A complex, time-sensitive problem. And I was very, very good at solving problems. A neighbor is being aggressively stupid, honey, I said, heading for the garage. I'm going to go be aggressively competent. In the corner of the garage, behind the lawnmower and a stack of Sarah's gardening pots, was my old go bag. It was a battered canvas satchel I used to keep in my truck. It was supposed to be for emergencies, but mostly it was full of the tools of my trade: heavy-duty wrenches, pressure gauges, flashlights, and a thick binder of municipal water system schematics for the entire county that I had forgotten to return upon retirement. Sarah stood at the door to the garage, a worried look on her face. "Leo, what are you going to do? Please don't start a war with Carol." I paused, my hand on the bag. "Honey, this isn't a war," I said, a slow grin spreading across my face. "This is an emergency infrastructure repair, a civic duty, and frankly, it's the most exciting thing that's happened to me in months. I didn't run. Running is for people who haven't planned ahead." I walked, briskly and with purpose, across my perfectly manicured lawn, across the hot asphalt of Maple Lane, and onto the common area. I ignored the valve Carol had closed. That was her trap. That was HOA property. Messing with it would be trespassing, vandalism, exactly the kind of ammunition she'd love to use against me. No, I went 50 feet further down the line, to a large rectangular iron plate set flush with the grass. It was heavy, solid, and stamped with the city's municipal utility seal. This was my turf. This was the cover to the main distribution manifold for the entire subdivision. From my bag, I pulled a pry bar. With a grunt and the satisfying protest of metal on metal, I popped the heavy cover off its seat. A wave of cool, damp air washed over me. I peered down into the subterranean vault. It was beautiful. A pristine 12-inch Class 52 ductile iron main ran the length of the vault, glistening with condensation. Branching off it was a complex but logical array of smaller pipes, gate valves, butterfly valves, and meters, all installed to the exact specifications I had personally signed off on a decade ago. It was like seeing an old friend. "Hello, darling," I murmured. "Let's dance." My mind raced, ticking off the steps. The fire station's dedicated 6-inch line branched off the main right here, before the smaller valve Carol had closed. My target was a parallel 4-inch bypass loop, a section of pipe designed to be used by city crews to reroute water during maintenance on the primary line. Both of its gate valves were, of course, closed and sealed. I slid down the iron ladder into the vault. The air was thick with the smell of earth and chlorinated water. I pulled a heavy 4-foot-long valve wrench from my bag. The first gate valve was stiff. It hadn't been turned in years. I planted my feet, leaned into it, and put my entire 180 pounds of retired fury into the wrench. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a deep groan that echoed in the concrete vault, it began to turn. The sound of rushing water filled the pipe next to my ear. One down. I scrambled over to the second valve on the other end of the bypass loop. This one turned more easily. As I cranked it open, I could feel the change in pressure, the shudder in the pipes as thousands of gallons of water were diverted from their main path around Carol's pathetic little blockade and surging towards the fire station. I pulled a pressure gauge from my bag, screwed it onto a test port, and watched the needle jump. 62 psi. Full, glorious, uninterrupted flow. I climbed out of the vault, my heart pounding with a thrill I hadn't felt since we averted a citywide water main break back in 08. I checked my watch. Time elapsed, 1 minute, 47 seconds. Not bad for an old man. Just as I was about to replace the heavy cover, a young firefighter came running out of the station, his face a mask of panic. "The water's off! The tanker can't refill! The chief is screaming on the radio!" he yelled at me. I didn't say a word. I just pointed a greasy thumb over my shoulder towards the station. "Try it now, kid." He gave me a bewildered look and sprinted back inside. A moment later, I heard it. The glorious, high-pitched whine of a high-volume pump kicking on, followed by the deep, gushing roar of water filling the tanker. The rookie reappeared at the bay door, his mouth hanging open. He just stared at me with a look of pure, unadulterated reverence. Before either of us could speak, a black SUV with flashing lights squealed to a stop on the road. The door flew open, and out stepped Fire Chief Miller. He was a tall, imposing man with a salt-and-pepper mustache and an aura of someone who did not have time for games. He took in the scene. Me, covered in a bit of dirt, standing over an open city manifold, and the sound of his tanker happily refilling. "What the hell happened here?" he boomed, his eyes locking onto mine. I wiped my hands on an old rag from my bag. "Your neighbor, Carol, committed an act of what I'd generously call civic terrorism," I said, my voice calm. "I, in turn, committed an act of emergency plumbing. I suspect my act carries a significantly smaller penalty in a court of law." Chief Miller's eyes narrowed. "You're the guy from 114 Maple Lane, right? The engineer?" "The retired engineer," I corrected him. "Which means I have way too much time on my hands for this kind of nonsense." A flicker of understanding, and then respect, crossed his face. He walked over to the open vault, peered inside, and saw my handiwork. He looked at the bypass loop, then back at me. A slow grin tugged at the corner of his mustache. He strode over and extended a hand. "I don't know what the official city rule book says about this, and right now I don't care," he said, his handshake firm and strong. "You just did this city and my crew a massive service. Thank you, Mr. Maxwell." "Leo," I said. "Miller." An alliance was forged right there on the perfectly manicured grass of the common area, sealed in shared competence and a mutual contempt for dangerous stupidity. Our moment of mutual professional respect was shattered by a sound that could curdle milk at 50 paces, the shriek of an enraged Carol Peterson. She must have heard the pumps. She came storming out of her house, a human thundercloud in a pastel polo. She saw me and Chief Miller shaking hands. She saw the open manifold cover on city property, not her HOA common ground. Her brain, unable to process this deviation from her carefully laid plan, seemed to short-circuit. "What do you think you're doing?" she screeched, marching towards us, her finger pointed accusingly at me. "That is a restricted utility vault. You are trespassing. You are tampering with municipal property. I am calling the police." I took a deep, cleansing breath, savoring the moment. This was the payoff. "Please do, Carol," I said, my voice dripping with a calm she couldn't stand. "And when they get here, you can explain to them, and to Fire Chief Miller here, and eventually to a judge, why you deliberately chose to shut off the water supply to a fire station during an active fire call. I'm sure they'll be fascinated by your reasoning regarding the petunias." Her face went from red to a sort of mottled purple. "This has nothing to do with the petunias. This is about respecting the established protocols. You have violated—" She never got to finish her sentence. Chief Miller took one step forward. He wasn't yelling. He didn't have to. His voice was low, cold, and heavy with authority. "Ma'am," he said, "what you did was a Class A misdemeanor under State Public Safety Code 143.7. It's called reckless endangerment. My crew is fighting a 3-alarm fire right now, and you knowingly tampered with their ability to do their job. So I suggest you go back inside your house before you say another word that elevates your little tantrum to a felony." Carol sputtered. Words failed her. For the first time since I'd moved here, Carol Peterson was speechless. She looked from the chief's stony face to my smug grin, and something inside her broke. She whipped out her phone, her fingers stabbing at the screen, and retreated towards her beige fortress. Oh yes, she was making the call. 10 minutes later, a police cruiser glided to a stop. Out stepped 2 officers. The first, Officer Davis, was a veteran with a thick mustache and eyes that had seen every flavor of human foolishness. The second, Officer Rodriguez, was younger, sharper, his uniform still crisp, a man who clearly believed in the power of the rule book. They were immediately plunged into a suburban Rashomon. First, they listened to Carol, who had re-emerged from her house, armed with her HOA binder. "He's a menace," she squawked, pointing at me. "A vigilante. He tore open the city infrastructure like a wild animal. He's probably rerouting the water to his house to create a private water park and not paying his utility bills." Next, they listened to Chief Miller, who laid out the facts in a calm, authoritative monotone. "This man is a hero. That woman, Carol Peterson, deliberately and maliciously shut off our water supply, endangering the lives of my firefighters and the public. Mr. Maxwell here rectified a dangerous situation with skill and precision." Finally, they turned to me. I leaned against the manifold cover, the picture of unconcerned competence. "Officers," I began, "there was a clear and present public safety emergency caused by that woman over there. As a concerned citizen with, let's say, a particular set of skills, I implemented a temporary non-destructive solution using existing city infrastructure. You'll find no damage was done, and essential public services were restored in under 2 minutes. You're welcome." Davis and Rodriguez exchanged a long, tired look. They were caught in a bureaucratic nightmare. On one hand, Carol had clearly committed a serious crime. On the other hand, I had popped a manhole cover and cranked a bunch of valves I wasn't technically authorized to touch. Officer Davis sighed, the sound heavy with the weight of 1,000 stupid domestic disputes. "Sir," he said to me, his gaze lingering on my greasy hands, "you can't just go popping manhole covers." I raised an eyebrow. "Is there a specific ordinance you'd like to cite, officer? Or are we just working off a general feeling of that seems wrong?" Officer Rodriguez, the by-the-book one, stepped in. "Sir, unauthorized access to municipal utilities is a city code violation. We're going to have to file a report." He paused. "On everyone." They took our statements. Carol was indignant. The chief was factual. I was, I'd like to think, helpfully sarcastic. The 2 cops looked at each other, their expressions a perfect blend of confusion and weary amusement. They told us all not to touch anything else, got in their car, and drove away, leaving the 3 of us standing in a state of tense, unresolved victory. The first battle was over. It was a draw on paper, but I knew I had fired the first shot in a war for the very soul of Maple Creek Estates. A day later, my doorbell rang. It was Chief Miller, holding a white paper box. "Contraband," he said with a straight face as I let him in. He opened the box on my kitchen island to reveal a dozen donuts, none of which were on the HOA's approved pastry list. "I figured you'd earned them." Sarah, who had been listening to my triumphant retelling of the events with a mixture of pride and terror, poured him a cup of coffee. "So, what's the fallout?" I asked, biting into a maple bacon donut that tasted like pure rebellion. "The city attorney is looking into it," Miller said, making air quotes with his fingers, "which means a junior lawyer is trying to figure out how to charge Carol without her suing the city for emotional distress. The bureaucracy is a slow-moving beast, Leo. I can't risk her trying something like this again. Your bypass was genius, but it's temporary. And as those cops pointed out, technically unauthorized." A familiar gleam entered my eye. The thrill of the problem. "Chief," I said, leaning forward, "what if we made it permanent?" Miller raised an eyebrow. "A new, dedicated, tamper-proof spur line," I continued, my mind already sketching the blueprints. "Tapped directly from the 12-inch main, running a whole new line straight to the station, completely independent of the HOA's common area valve. Something with a subterranean access point on fire department property, with a lock only the city, and you have the key to—" Miller let out a low whistle. "Leo, that's a capital improvement project. That would take city planning months, maybe years, environmental reviews, public bids, tens of thousands of dollars. Or," I said, pausing for dramatic effect, "it takes a retired engineer with the original blueprints, a friendly local contractor, and a few nights of discreet work. We could call it a pilot program, to test the feasibility of a rapid infrastructure upgrade protocol." A slow grin spread across Chief Miller's face. He took a long sip of his coffee. "I can't officially approve this, Leo. You know that." "I know." "But," he continued, setting the mug down, "I can make sure my entire crew is scheduled for mandatory nighttime training drills on the far side of town, from, say, 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. for the next week or so. And our exterior security cameras? They've been on the fritz lately. Terrible glare from that new streetlight." He stood up to leave. "Good luck with your pilot program." Now I needed muscle. I needed a contractor. Not one of the big corporate outfits with shiny trucks and clipboards. I needed a guy who gets things done. I found his number on a crumpled flyer I'd picked up at the hardware store, stuck to the bulletin board between an ad for kitten adoptions and a lost parrot. "Vince's Excavation and Vaguely Defined Services," the flyer read. "No job too weird, cash appreciated." Perfect. I met Vince at a Greasy Spoon diner on the edge of town. The kind of place where the coffee is strong and the waitresses call you Hun. Vince was a large, barrel-chested man with hands like catcher's mitts and a fine layer of permanent dirt under his fingernails. He looked like he could excavate a trench with his teeth. He listened to my pitch without a word, his face an unreadable mask, just staring at me over the top of his chipped coffee mug. I rolled out a copy of the city's water main blueprints on the sticky table between us. He finally spoke, his voice a low rumble. "So let me get this straight," he said, tapping a sausage-sized finger on the blueprint. "You, some retired pencil pusher from the suburbs, want me to illegally tap into a 12-inch city water main, run 200 feet of new copper under a bunch of pristine sod, and hook it up to a fire station, all right under the nose of the Wicked Witch of the West." "I wasn't a pencil pusher," I clarified. "I was the guy who designed the systems that allow you to flush your toilet. And yes, that is the gist of it. Think of it as a patriotic act of malicious compliance." Vince stared at the blueprints, then at me. His cynical expression slowly cracked, and a wide, gap-toothed grin spread across his face. "You're completely insane," he chuckled. "I like it. My guys will need a mini excavator, 200 feet of 2-inch Type K copper, a whole mess of fittings, and a case of whatever beer the fire chief is drinking. And my weird job surcharge is 20%. "Done," I said, shaking his massive, calloused hand. Project Freedom Flow was officially a go. Carol, having failed to achieve satisfaction through law enforcement, retreated to her natural habitat, bureaucratic warfare. The official violation notices started appearing in my mailbox, delivered with the solemnity of papal bulls. The first was a crisp, cream-colored envelope. Fine hash 1. $50 for unauthorized conference with a municipal employee, Fire Chief Miller, on designated common grounds. The next day brought another. Fine hash 2. $100 for leaving a garage door open for more than the prescribed 15-minute grace period. This was from when I'd retrieved my go bag. She'd been watching. The pièce de résistance arrived on Friday. Fine #3. $200 for creating a public nuisance by attracting law enforcement vehicles to the community, thereby lowering the neighborhood's perceived tranquility index. I was fairly certain she'd just invented the tranquility index, but I had to admire her creativity. Sarah was aghast. "Leo, this is pure harassment. You have to fight this. You have to call a lawyer," she said, waving the notices in the air. I calmly took them from her and slid them into a manila folder I'd labeled "Evidence for the Prosecution." "Oh, I'm not going to fight them, honey," I said with a placid smile. "I'm going to let her build my entire legal case for me. Keep talking, Carol. Every baseless fine is just another nail in your own coffin." Meanwhile, Project Freedom Flow commenced under the cover of darkness. It was a masterpiece of clandestine construction. Vince proved to be an artist in his own right. The first night, his crew delivered the mini-excavator on a flatbed trailer at 2 a.m., the engine muffled with old moving blankets. They worked swiftly and quietly, using only hand signals and headlamps. The work was a series of barely averted disasters that bordered on slapstick comedy. On the second night, Mrs. Higgins from 3 doors down let her yappy little terrier out for its late-night constitutional. The dog, named Sir Reginald, immediately started yapping at the strange shapes moving in the darkness. Vince, without missing a beat, pulled a piece of beef jerky from his pocket and tossed it. Sir Reginald was instantly silenced, our new best friend and co-conspirator. The biggest scare came on night 3. One of Carol's Beige Brigade lieutenants, a man named Todd who wore boat shoes with no socks, came out for a late-night stroll. Vince's crew froze in the half-dug trench. I was watching from my window, connected to Vince via a cheap pair of walkie-talkies. "Talk to me, Leo. What's the play?" Vince whispered. "Stall him," I whispered back. "Be official." Vince climbed out of the trench, holding a clipboard I'd given him for just such an occasion. "Evening, sir," he said, his voice taking on a formal, bored tone. "City utilities. We're chasing a sewer gas leak." Todd peered nervously at the trench. "Sewer gas? Is it dangerous?" "Only if you're a fan of breathing," Vince deadpanned. I fed him a line through the walkie-talkie. "Yeah," Vince continued, looking at his clipboard. "We're getting high readings of hydrogen sulfide and methane near the tertiary lift station. Probably shouldn't be out here. The gas can cause, spontaneous neurological events." Todd's eyes went wide. "Oh my God!" He practically sprinted back to his house. Vince clicked the walkie-talkie. "Spontaneous neurological events?" "Best I could do on short notice," I replied. My nightly conversations with Vince became the highlight of my retirement. "You know," he grunted one night, covered in mud as he tightened a compression fitting, "for a guy who spent his life behind a desk, you're pretty handy with a pipe wrench." "This isn't work, Vince," I said, passing him a flashlight. "This is art." Carol, meanwhile, knew something was up. She couldn't prove it, but she could hear the faint, muffled sounds. So she pivoted from fines to psychological warfare. The neighborhood Facebook group became her battlefield. Carol Peterson, concerned resident. Alert. There has been suspicious nocturnal activity on the common grounds. I urge everyone to be vigilant. This is how property values begin to erode. Remember, the bylaws are for your protection. Carol Peterson. I have heard from a reliable source that certain individuals are planning unauthorized modifications to our shared infrastructure. This is not only illegal, but dangerous. This is the work of a radical anti-HOA anarchist who wants to let people paint their houses purple. I watched the drama unfold with a bowl of popcorn in my lap, screenshotting every unhinged post. And then I began my counteroffensive. Not with angry posts, but with the cold, hard steel of the bylaws themselves. I took a photo of Carol's trash bins, left out a full 12 hours after collection. I emailed it to the HOA board and CC'd the entire neighborhood email list, citing Bylaw 21. I took a photo of the unapproved decorative wrought iron flamingo on her lawn, emailed again, citing the statute against non-standard lawn ornamentation. I documented her car being parked with its left wheel touching the white line of her driveway space, a clear violation of the vehicular positioning addendum. It was war by 1,000 paper cuts, and I was enjoying every second of it. The inevitable happened on the 5th night of the project. A cruiser once again glided down Maple Lane. Davis and Rodriguez. They found Vince and me admiring a perfectly laid section of copper pipe, glistening in the moonlight. This time their approach was different, less formal, more exasperatedly friendly. Officer Davis didn't even get out of the car at first, just rolled down the window. "Leo," he said, sighing my name like a prayer to a god he no longer believed in. "We have to ask you to stop." "Stop what, officer?" I asked innocently, admiring the fine craftsmanship of this municipal-grade copper tubing. It's a real work of art. Vince here is a master. Vince grunted in agreement. Rodriguez got out and walked over, his flashlight beam tracing the line of the trench. "We got another call," he said, rubbing his temples, "from the city manager, who got a call from Carol, who apparently now has him on speed dial. The city can't officially sanction this," Rodriguez said, gesturing vaguely at our entire operation. "Our hands are tied. Legal says it's a mess." "But," I noted, "you're not arresting me." Officer Davis finally got out of the car and leaned against the hood. "Let's just say the paperwork for that arrest would be a certifiable nightmare. When we filed our report, the fire chief's commendation of a civic-minded citizen somehow got attached directly to Carol's complaint of maniacal vandalism. The city attorney apparently got a migraine just reading it. He wants this to just go away." He looked at our nearly completed trench. "So just be careful, and try to be done soon, for the love of God." They got back in their car and drove off, leaving us in the quiet of the night. It was a tacit admission. The system, in its own clumsy, bureaucratic way, was on our side. They had waved the white flag. We were finishing the final trench the next night, the one that would connect our new line to the station's internal plumbing. We were digging close to Carol's property line, being extra careful. That's when Vince's shovel hit something with a dull thunk, something that wasn't on my blueprints. "Whoa," he said. "Got something here, boss. Plastic?" I jumped into the trench. It was a small, 1-inch black polyethylene pipe, clearly not part of the official city installation. It was a shoddy amateur job. "Where does it go?" I asked. Vince and I started digging carefully, following the line. It ran from the direction of the fire station's main, the very one Carol had shut off. We followed it the other way, inch by inch, until it disappeared under the property line of Carol's meticulously landscaped yard, heading directly for her award-winning prize pig petunia bed. The truth hit me like a physical blow. A beautiful, perfect, crystalline truth, shimmering with petty hypocrisy. Carol wasn't just obsessed with that valve because some firefighters had flattened a few flowers. She was stealing water from the fire department's dedicated, unmetered line to irrigate her petunias for free. That's why she knew exactly where the valve was. That's why she had a key. That's why she was so territorial about that specific patch of land. Her entire righteous crusade, the fines, the Facebook posts, the calls to the police. It was all a massive, desperate cover-up. She wasn't trying to punish the fire department for their transgression. She was trying to stop them from ever discovering hers. I looked at Vince, whose muddy face was illuminated by my headlamp. A slow grin spread across my own. "Vince, my friend," I said, pulling out my phone to take pictures. "This isn't just a smoking gun. This is a ballistic missile with Carol Peterson written on the warhead." Feeling the tide turning against her, sensing the whispers and the subtle shift in the neighborhood's allegiance, Carol did what all cornered despots do. She doubled down. An email was sent to the entire community. Emergency HOA meeting. Mandatory attendance. Agenda. The rogue actions of Leo Maxwell and the preservation of our community standards. This was it, her last stand. She was going to try and humiliate me publicly, fine me into oblivion, and get a motion passed to force the city to rip out my beautiful, nearly completed bypass. The community clubhouse was packed. It had the tense, buzzing atmosphere of a show trial. Carol's beige brigade was in the front row, a phalanx of khaki and disapproval. The nervous, silent majority filled the chairs in the back, drawn by the promise of drama. I sat in the front row with Sarah, who squeezed my hand. "You ready for this?" she whispered. "Honey," I whispered back, "I've been preparing for this my entire retirement." Carol stood at the podium, a portrait of wounded dignity. She launched into an impassioned, tearful speech about rules, order, and the sanctity of property values. She painted me as a monster, a loose cannon who had terrorized the community with my heavy machinery and reckless disregard for our bylaws. She had a slideshow. It featured dramatic black and white photos of the dug-up turf. This anarchy," she said, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion, "is what he wants. This is the future he offers, a future of chaos and dirt." Then, it was my turn. I walked to the podium and calmly plugged my laptop into the projector. Sarah gave me a subtle go-get-'em nod. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice even. "Carol has painted a very dramatic picture, but I'd like to talk about facts." My first slide was a simple diagram of the water system, showing the valve she had closed. I explained, in simple terms, the public safety risk. I cited the state code, the one Chief Miller had mentioned. "Now, you don't have to take my word for it," I said. "I believe we have an expert in the room." I gestured to the back, where Chief Miller was standing, arms crossed, in his full dress uniform. The crowd murmured and turned. His presence changed the entire dynamic of the room. The chief walked to the front. He didn't need the podium. His voice filled the space. "What Mr. Maxwell has said is correct," he stated simply. "The actions taken by Miss Peterson on the day of the fire were unconscionable and placed my crew and the public at risk. The actions taken by Mr. Maxwell, while unorthodox, were heroic. He's a credit to this community." The murmur in the room grew louder. The tide was turning. "The work itself was also performed to the highest standard," I continued, clicking to the next slide, which showed a picture of Vince. "My colleague, Mr. Vince, who is here tonight, can attest to that." Vince, standing near the chief, just grunted and gave a thumbs up. "The work is solid," he rumbled. "Up to code." Then came the final act. "Now," I said, my voice dropping slightly. I was very curious during this whole process as to why Carol was so intimately familiar with the fire station's water valve. At first, I thought it was just her passionate, admirable commitment to the bylaws, but then my colleague, Mr. Vince, and I discovered something interesting. I clicked to the next slide. It was a crystal-clear photo of the illegal, 1-inch plastic pipe connected to the main. A collective gasp went through the room. I clicked again. The next slide was a diagram I'd drawn, a map showing the illegal pipe's path directly from the fire main to the sprinkler heads in Carol's petunia bed. I followed it with a video I'd taken, tracing the pipe through the dirt. My final slide was a conservative calculation of the thousands of gallons of unmetered stolen water she had likely used over the past several years. "It turns out," I concluded, looking directly at Carol, whose face had gone a chalky white, "this was never about petunias or rules or community safety. It was about Carol Peterson stealing public utilities to fuel her own vanity project. She didn't shut off the water to punish the fire department. She shut it off to prevent them from discovering her own crime during any potential maintenance." The room was dead silent. You could hear a bylaw drop. And then Carol Peterson, the iron-willed queen of Maple Creek Estates, completely and gloriously melted down. "Lies!" she shrieked, jumping to her feet. "It's all lies! It's CGI! He's a hacker! He faked those pictures! It's not true!" Her carefully constructed facade of righteous indignation didn't just crack, it exploded. She was raving, her finger pointing wildly, her voice shrill with pure, undiluted panic. That's when the two figures standing by the door started walking to the front, Officer Davis and Officer Rodriguez. They had, at my request, agreed to attend to keep the peace. Officer Davis walked right up to the podium, ignoring Carol's tirade. He spoke into the microphone, his voice calm and steady. "Actually, ma'am," he said, and the entire room went silent again. "We got a call from the city water department this afternoon. They cross-referenced Mr. Maxwell's photographs with their own master plans. They'd like to have a word with you about utility theft." He turned to Carol. "Perhaps you can come with us." Carol stood frozen, her mouth open, her face a mask of utter defeat. Her beige brigade backers were suddenly fascinated by their own shoes, sinking into their chairs to avoid the fallout. Then, from the back of the room, a single person started to clap. It was one of the nervous neighbors. Then another joined in, and another. Soon, the entire clubhouse, minus the half-dozen members of the brigade, was filled with a rising tide of applause as the two police officers politely escorted a sputtering, defeated Carol Peterson out into the night. The HOA, deprived of its queen, fell into chaos, and then, remarkably, into reason. At an emergency meeting the following week, one that was far more civil, a vote of no confidence in the entire old board was passed unanimously. A reluctant but sensible retired accountant named George was voted in as the new president. His first act was to propose a motion to officially nullify all of Carol's recent fines against me. It passed with a round of cheers. His second act was to propose the Common Sense Amendment, which struck a dozen of the most ridiculous bylaws from the books. The city, meanwhile, performed a beautiful act of bureaucratic face-saving. My project was retroactively designated a successful pilot program for emergency infrastructure upgrades. They sent a city crew out to officially inspect the work. The foreman, a grizzled old-timer, took one look at Vince's clean connections and my logical layout, and whistled. "This is better than our own stuff," he confided in me. He and his crew spent an hour officially connecting the new line to the station, signing off on all the paperwork, and formally decommissioning the old valve near Carol's former petunia bed for good. A few days later, Vince and I were sitting on the curb in front of my house, drinking a couple of cold beers, and watching the sunset paint the sky in the colors that were definitely not on the approved HOA palette. The sod over our trench was already knitting together, the scar on the neighborhood healing. "You know," Vince said, taking a long pull from his bottle, "for a retired guy, you sure know how to stir the pot." "I wasn't retired, Vince," I said, watching a kid ride by on a brightly colored bicycle that would have given Carol an aneurysm. "I was just in standby mode, waiting for a problem worth solving." "So, what's next?" he asked. "Gonna run for mayor? Take over the world?" I chuckled. "God, no. I think I'm going to take a nap. This was exhausting." The news traveled quickly. Carol and her husband had put their house on the market. It sold in less than a week, at a slight loss, to a young family with 3 loud kids and a golden retriever. They were moving to a different state, presumably one with less vigilant retired engineers. A month later, life in Maple Creek Estates had found a new, more relaxed equilibrium. A few more colorful welcome mats had appeared. I heard the gentle, unsanctioned sound of wind chimes from a few houses down. It was the sound of freedom. I was on my porch, sipping a tall glass of iced tea. Sarah was next to me, reading her book, her hand resting on my arm. "You're a menace, Leo Maxwell," she said without looking up, a smile in her voice. "But you're my menace." I was about to reply when I heard a familiar sound, the deep rumble of the engine from Station #4. They were rolling by, returning from a call, not rushing. As they passed my house, the entire crew, with Chief Miller riding shotgun, leaned out the windows. They were smiling, waving, giving me a big collective thumbs up. Then the driver reached up and gave a long, triumphant blast of the air horn. The sound, loud and clear and utterly glorious, echoed through the peaceful, beige but getting better neighborhood. I smiled, raised my glass to them in a silent toast, and took a sip. The war was over. I had won. My retirement project was complete. And for the first time in a long time, I leaned back in my chair, perfectly, blissfully content.